Poor Waitress paid for a young man. The next day, 300 soldiers lined up for her. Rain tapped steadily against the diner's windows, thin streams running down the glass like tears. Inside, the warmth from the coffee machines did little to ease the fatigue pooling in Eliza's shoulders. The late shift always left her drained, but she wore her exhaustion behind a smile, pouring refills and wiping counters with quiet grace. It was near midnight when the door creaked open. A gust of cold air swept through, turning a few heads. A young man stepped inside, soaked to the bone, his coat torn at the sleeve and boots caked with dried mud. He moved slowly, not out of age, but caution, as if unsure whether he was welcome. Eliza looked up from the register, meeting his eyes. They were clear, startlingly so, beneath the tangled hair and wet lashes. He walked to the counter, his hands slightly trembling. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, voice soft, barely louder than the rain. "I just need a meal. I have no money, but if you could spare a sandwich, anything warm, I'll do dishes, clean floors, whatever you need." Eliza hesitated. He was young, maybe her age, maybe younger, but the lines in his face told a story far older. There was no begging in his tone, no pity sought, only quiet dignity wrapped in desperation. She looked toward the kitchen, then at the tray holding a full plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, a canceled order, still hot. Without another word, she slid the tray off the warmer, added a cup of black coffee, and placed it gently in front of him. "Someone canceled their order," she said. "Seems a waste to throw it out." The man blinked. "I thank you. I mean it," she smiled, already turning back to grab extra napkins. "You don't have to mean it, just eat." But the moment shattered as a sharp voice cut through the quiet. "Eliza," her manager Greg stepped out from the back, his expression thunderous. "What is this?" "It was a returned meal," she said calmly. "He's hungry." "I do not care if the Pope is hungry. We don't give away food." Eliza stood her ground. "It would have gone to waste." "Not your call," Greg snapped. "You're not running a charity. You want to feed the whole damn street? Do it on your own dime." Eliza looked at the young man who had set his fork down, already halfway to standing. "I'll leave," he murmured. "No," she said quickly. Then, turning to Greg, "Take it out of my tips." Greg's lip curled. "You're fired." Silence fell like a dropped glass. The diner froze. Eliza untied her apron slowly, placed it on the counter, and nodded once. No anger, no tears, just tired acceptance. She stepped into the rain, the door slamming shut behind her. The cold hit her like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She walked down the street, her coat thin against the wind, the weight of her decision heavier than her soaked shoes. Behind her, footsteps splashed through puddles. She turned. The young man had followed her, jacket pulled tight, his eyes searching hers. "I'll never forget what you did in there," he said, voice rough with cold and something else. "You didn't treat me like trash. You saw me." Eliza looked at him, truly looked. The storm had etched shadows under his eyes, but something in him was unbroken. She offered a small smile, one hand pressed to her chest to keep in the warmth of that moment. "Everyone deserves to be seen," she whispered. Then, without another word, she turned and walked into the night, unaware that this moment, this choice, would echo far beyond what she could ever imagine. The room above the laundromat smelled faintly of detergent and mildew. Eliza closed the door behind her with a tired sigh, letting her damp jacket fall from her shoulders onto the lone chair by the wall. The heater groaned when she twisted the knob, more noise than warmth. Smokey, her rescued orange tabby, meowed from his perch on the windowsill, stretching lazily before curling back into himself. She sat on the edge of her mattress, toes tingling with cold, fingers still clutching the last of her dignity. Fired, just like that, for feeding a stranger a meal someone else had already abandoned. Her tips for the week, what little she had, were already gone on cat food and a half bag of groceries. Rent was due in 4 days, and she was already late on the electric bill. She stared at the ceiling, blinking back tears that refused to fall. The next morning, a knock at the door startled her. Not a loud knock, just 2 soft taps. When she opened it, no one stood in the hallway. Just a plain, white envelope lying at her feet. Cautiously, she picked it up and stepped back inside. The flap wasn't sealed. Inside was cash, enough to cover next month's rent. She gasped softly, fingers trembling as she unfolded the note tucked inside. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. People like you deserve more than survival. There was no name, no signature, just those words and the quiet weight of them. Eliza clutched the paper to her chest, her mind racing. Who? Why? She thought back to the man from the diner, his clear eyes, the way he'd looked at her like she was the first person to truly see him in a long time. Later that week, while walking home from a nearby food pantry, Eliza paused at the corner of the church. A small crowd had gathered in the alley beside it, volunteers setting up folding tables with warm food, clean socks, and first aid kits. She stepped closer, drawn by the scent of baked bread and the quiet laughter of people who hadn't had much to laugh about. And then she saw him. Same eyes, same build, but now clean-shaven, wearing a dark wool coat and gloves. He stood behind a table, handing out wrapped sandwiches and thermoses of coffee. His smile was quiet but real, the kind that came from someplace honest. She stood frozen for a moment before stepping forward. "Hey," she said, unsure if he'd remember. He looked up and smiled like he had been waiting for her. "Eliza." She blinked. "How did you—" "I asked around," he said simply, reaching beneath the table. He pulled out a wrapped sandwich and offered it to her. She hesitated. "It's turkey," he said, "with cranberry spread. I remembered you mentioned it was your favorite when you served me." She accepted it slowly, fingers brushing his. It was warm. "You didn't have to." He shook his head. "You gave me my first real meal in days. This is the first one I get to share." There was a quiet between them, not awkward, just gentle. "You look different," she said. He chuckled. "A shower and a shave will do that." She studied him. There was something steady in the way he stood, something that didn't quite fit the story of a man down on his luck. But before she could ask more, a woman behind him called his name. "Aiden." He turned, gave a small wave, then looked back at Eliza. "Come back tomorrow. I'd like to talk more." And with that, he turned back to his table, handing out cups of coffee to a pair of veterans who patted him on the back. Eliza walked home that night with the sandwich still warm in her hands and something even warmer curling in her chest. She didn't know who Aiden really was yet, but she knew, somehow, her story with him wasn't over. The winter deepened slowly in the small town of Millridge, casting frost over windows and weaving chill into the breath of morning. Yet, amidst the cold, Eliza found warmth, not in electricity or blankets, but in the quiet presence of a man who never quite left her thoughts. Aiden. He had become a constant in the backdrop of her struggling days. At the community soup kitchen, she would often find him already there before her, tying aprons behind his back, sleeves rolled up, greeting the elderly with a kind nod and children with warm jokes. At the charity clinic where Eliza had taken a part-time job helping schedule appointments, Aiden would swing by, dropping off supplies or walking patients across the slushy street without fanfare. "You volunteer everywhere," she teased once, handing him a box of donated scarves to distribute. "I like warm things," he replied with a shrug. People, soup, scarves, smiles. But whenever she asked about him, his job, where he lived, how he came to be in town, he'd dodge the question with a half smile and change the subject. "Some stories take time to tell," he once said, eyes flickering toward the snow-dusted rooftops. "And some are better heard when you're ready to listen." It should have bothered her, his mystery, but it didn't. Not when his actions spoke louder than most confessions ever could. One morning, as Eliza stepped out of her apartment, she found a single daisy placed carefully on the doormat. Slightly crooked, bright against the gray cement. Tied around its stem was a scrap of brown string and a note scribbled on the back of a bakery receipt. "Just because the world's been gray doesn't mean you have to be." It was the first time in weeks she genuinely laughed. Not a tired exhale, not a hollow smile. An honest laugh that bubbled up and startled even Smokey, who blinked at her from the windowsill. She tucked the daisy into a mason jar and placed it on her nightstand. It stayed there, still, long after its petals began to curl inward. Their rhythm became something sacred, a nod across the pantry, a cup of cocoa passed wordlessly at the bus stop, a shared silence on the church steps after closing time. But one Friday, the chill seeped in deeper than usual. Eliza woke with a sore throat and a fever that burned behind her eyes. She wrapped herself in layers and still felt like ice had taken root in her bones. Work called, asking her to rest and stay home. Her neighbor, an elderly woman named Marge, dropped off a bottle of ginger tea, but by nightfall Eliza couldn't keep anything down. She curled into herself beneath 3 blankets, Smokey pressed to her side, shivering despite the space heater humming at her feet. The world felt very far away, her breath short, her head pounding. A soft knock stirred her. Weakly she shuffled to the door. No one there. But on the ground a small thermos steamed gently inside a cloth-wrapped basket. Beside it, a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers she opened the note. "I know this town gets cold, especially when your body's fighting to stay warm. Tonight let me return just a little of what you gave me. It's chicken soup, my mother's recipe. Eat slowly, feel loved." It was signed with just one letter, A. The soup was rich, golden, with carrots cut unevenly and noodles that clung to the spoon like they were afraid to be left behind. Each sip warmed more than her stomach. It warmed a place inside her chest that had been quiet for far too long. She didn't see Aiden that night, but she didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, they didn't talk about feelings or plans, but something was building, delicate, intentional, a trust not declared, but built from shared kindness and unspoken glances. And though she still didn't know who he truly was, Eliza no longer feared the mystery, because whatever his story, it had led him to her doorstep, and somehow, that made all the difference. The knock came like thunder. Eliza opened the door with a hesitant hand, still in her faded diner uniform from the night before. She had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted and heartsick from too many shifts and too little rest. But what she saw on the other side of the door jolted her fully awake. 2 soldiers stood tall in full dress uniform, caps under one arm, stoic and silent. Behind them stretched a line of black military vehicles, engines humming, forming an arc around her narrow street. "Eliza Hart?" the taller one asked. She nodded slowly, her breath caught in her throat. "You're requested for immediate transport to Fort Alder." I think you have the wrong person," she stammered. "We do not." The soldier's voice was firm but respectful. "There is a ceremony. You are the guest of honor." Neighbors were peeking out through blinds, stepping onto porches, whispering. A child dropped his bicycle. A woman clutched her chest. No one understood what was happening, least of all Eliza. The soldiers opened the rear door of the lead vehicle. "We've been instructed to escort you with full honors." Eliza didn't know what to say. Her body moved before her brain caught up. She climbed in. As the convoy pulled out of the neighborhood, sirens were not blaring, but the tension in the air was deafening. A caravan of black SUVs and military trucks rolled through town like a silent parade, traffic parting to let them pass. Police had blocked off intersections. People stood on sidewalks, pointing, filming, speculating. Inside the vehicle, Eliza sat frozen. Her palms were damp, her heart thundered. This had to be a mistake. Fort Alder came into view after nearly an hour. High fences, guarded towers, the massive flag snapping against a pale morning sky. The gates opened for them, and there, just past the checkpoint, was a sight that stole Eliza's breath. 300 soldiers stood in perfect formation, shoulder to shoulder, stretching across the field in rows. The entire front plaza of the base had been cleared for this moment. The soldiers' uniforms were pristine, boots shined, medals glinted in the sun, and not a single one moved or spoke. As Eliza stepped out of the vehicle, the silence was deafening. Even the wind seemed to still. Her shoes crunched on the gravel. She was led, trembling, down a path lined with honor guards. Their salutes were raised in unison, sharp, reverent, precise. At the far end of the path, on a small platform flanked by flags, stood a man she barely recognized. But her heart did. It was Aiden. Dressed in his formal military uniform, chest adorned with honors, cap under his arm, his posture proud, his face no longer shadowed by hunger or fatigue, but lit with clarity and quiet strength. She stopped halfway. "Aiden?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "What is this?" He stepped forward, his tone calm but powerful. "My name is Major Aiden Black. I serve in a Special Operations Division under a humanitarian arm of the U.S. Army. For the past few months I have been undercover, searching, watching." She shook her head, stunned. "You lied?" "I didn't lie. I didn't tell you who I was, because I needed to see something the world forgets." He looked around at the rows of soldiers. "I needed to see if kindness still existed without credit, if compassion could survive without spotlight. And then I met you." Eliza's breath caught. Aiden stepped closer. "You gave me food, but more than that, you gave me dignity. You looked at me like I was still someone." She swallowed hard, eyes burning. "Why are they all here?" Aiden turned to the soldiers and then back to her. "Because what you did, it mattered. More than you know. We brought 300 soldiers here today, not to intimidate, not to question, but to honor. To show you what happens when one person, doing one right thing, shakes the entire system awake." Eliza's hands trembled. She whispered, "I'm just a waitress." Aiden smiled, his eyes soft. "No, you're the reason hope is still real." And in that moment, before the silence lifted, Eliza realized she hadn't been summoned. She'd been saluted. The smell of warm cornbread drifted through the small hall of the newly opened community center. Paint still clung fresh to the walls, and sunlight filtered through windows that had not known light in years. Eliza stood at the center of it all, apron tied, sleeves rolled, and a quiet fire in her chest. She never imagined this would be her life, yet here she was, managing the center, supported by a military initiative. Her kitchen open to hungry children, tired veterans, single mothers, and anyone else the world had tried to forget. She had not asked for this role, but she had grown into it like roots through old soil. The oven timer dinged. Eliza pulled out a tray of roasted vegetables, the scent sharp and comforting. Laughter echoed from the next room, where a group of kids folded paper cranes with an ease only children possessed. At their side, crouched low, was Aiden. He had never once asked for recognition. Instead, he arrived early every Saturday morning with a bundle of wildflowers, daisies, goldenrod, sometimes a single white lily, and left them by the kitchen sink with a note that only read, "For the keeper of the flame." He fixed broken hinges without being asked, repaired the squealing faucet, taught the kids to fold napkins into animals for lunch trays. Some days he just sat with the elderly, listening, not talking, listening. Eliza watched him often, always from a quiet distance. It would have been easier if he had remained the man from the diner, mysterious, fleeting, like a moment of kindness she could cherish and let go. But Aiden stayed. And every act of tenderness, every moment he gave without asking anything in return, tugged gently at the walls she had built to protect a heart that had been broken more than once. Especially by the last man who said he loved her, then vanished when the rent was due, and life asked more than charm. One Thursday afternoon the center was busy, kids running in and out, volunteers handing out books and sandwiches. Eliza was slicing apples when she heard the small voice. "Miss Eliza?" She turned. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, stood holding a half-folded paper crane. Her braids were coming loose, and there was jelly on her chin. "Yes, sweetheart?" The girl looked serious. "Is Mr. Aiden your husband?" Eliza blinked. "No, he's not." "Oh," the child paused. "Is he your boyfriend?" Eliza smiled softly. "No, honey." The girl frowned, clearly puzzled. "Then what is he?" There was a pause, long enough for Eliza to feel her throat tighten. She glanced across the room. Aiden was kneeling beside another child, showing him how to twist pipe cleaners into stars. His eyes caught hers. He smiled, not the kind you give everyone, but the kind you save for someone who already knows the worst parts of you. Eliza looked back at the little girl. Kneeling beside her, she tucked the child's loose braid behind her ear and said quietly, "He's someone who made me want to believe again." The child tilted her head. "Believe in what?" Eliza's voice cracked, just a little. that not everyone leaves. That evening after the last bowl was washed and the children had gone home, Eliza found the usual wildflowers by the sink. But this time, instead of a single note, there were two. The first was, as always, for the keeper of the flame. The second said only, "I am still here, and I'm not going anywhere." The first chill of fall had crept into the corners of the community kitchen. Eliza stood alone that evening, apron untied, the last light of day spilling through the windows like honey. The laughter had faded, the chairs were stacked, and a warm quiet wrapped itself around the space she had slowly begun to call her own. On the prep table was something she had not expected, a small, time-worn tin box, its metal rusted slightly at the edges. Atop it, a folded slip of paper in handwriting she now knew by heart. "For the one who gave back my breath." Eliza opened the lid with careful fingers. Inside lay a simple silver chain with a small pendant shaped like a spoon. On its back, engraved in faint but steady strokes, were the words, "For the girl who fed my hope." Her breath caught. It was not jewelry meant to dazzle. It was something quieter, heavier, a piece of truth. Behind her, footsteps approached, soft, measured. She turned. Aidan stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, jacket dusted with leaves from the wind outside. For a long moment they didn't speak. Then he stepped closer, his voice low. "That spoon," he said, nodding toward the chain, "belonged to my mother. She used to say a meal made with care could fix more than a prescription. After my last deployment, I stopped believing that. I stopped believing in most things." He looked at her now, eyes unguarded. "I came back, but not really. I was angry. At the silence, at the world, at myself." He paused. "So, they gave me a different kind of mission. Send me out into the places we forget. Let me search for people who still believed in something better. People who give, even when the world takes." Eliza's fingers closed around the pendant. "And then," he added, stepping close enough for her to smell the faint cinnamon from the afternoon's cookies still clinging to his coat, "I met a waitress who offered me a plate of food without asking who I used to be, who didn't flinch when the world told her no, who stood taller when it got hard, and gave like it cost her nothing, even when it cost her everything." He reached out and took her hand, warm, gentle, steady. "You brought me back," he said, "not to the army, not to a title, but to myself. You reminded me what hope tastes like. It tastes like cornbread and chicken stew, and a quiet place where someone says your name like it matters." Eliza didn't speak. She couldn't. Her throat was tight with unshed tears, and her heart, still bruised from so many yesterdays, beat now with something dangerously close to faith. So instead of words, she turned back to the stove. From the oven, she pulled out a small dish, nothing fancy. Just roasted root vegetables, warm rolls, a pot of lentil soup still steaming beside it. She set the table in silence. 2 bowls, 2 spoons. Aidan sat. He didn't ask questions. They ate slowly, like people who knew what it meant to be hungry, not just for food but for understanding, for safety, for someone to see them and stay. When the last bite was gone and the tea had turned lukewarm in their cups, Aidan reached across the table and rested his hand atop hers again. "Thank you," he said softly, "for seeing me, before I even remembered who I was." Eliza finally looked up, eyes shining. "You made it easy," she whispered. "You showed up." The knock on the door came just after sunrise. Eliza, already at the kitchen stirring a pot of oatmeal for the morning meal, wiped her hands and opened it with sleepy eyes and flour on her cheek. A young officer stood at attention, his uniform crisp, his voice formal yet kind. "Miss Eliza James, we kindly request your presence outside." Immediately. She blinked, confused. "Outside? Why, please, you will understand when you see." Eliza stepped out in her worn sneakers and apron, still dusted with flour, but the moment her foot hit the pavement, she stopped. The main street, usually quiet in the early hours, was no longer just a road. It had become a corridor of honor. Lining both sides, shoulder to shoulder, in perfect formation, were soldiers. Hundreds of them, their uniforms gleaming under the early morning sun, their boots shining. their faces solemn. 300, at least. Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, men and women of every age and background, standing as one, saluting, silent. The town around them was still, as if the world itself had paused to bear witness. Shopkeepers peered through their windows. Early joggers stopped mid-stride. Cars pulled to the side. Engines hushed. A child on a bicycle stopped pedaling and simply stared. Eliza felt the breath leave her lungs. Her name was whispered in the wind, passed from soldier to soldier like a prayer. Eliza. She's here. 2 officers stepped forward and gently guided her down the street. As she walked, each soldier lifted their hand to their brow in a salute, not for a president, not for a general, but for a waitress, for a woman who had offered a warm plate to someone the world tried to forget. And at the end of the path, beneath a white arch of flags, stood a small stage. On it, a tall man in decorated dress blues. Aiden. But not the Aiden she had first met in a torn coat and quiet humility. This was Major Aiden Black, his chest full of honors, his bearing proud. But when he looked at her, it was not as a soldier. It was as a man in love. Eliza stepped up, trembling slightly. The air was thick with silence. She could barely hear her own breath. Aiden took the microphone, then paused. For a long moment he said nothing, and then, "There are many kinds of service." His voice was deep, steady, but full of something raw. Some carry weapons, some carry hope, some give orders, others give second chances. He turned to face her fully. "Eliza James gave me both." A hushed murmur moved through the crowd. "She did not know I was a soldier. She did not care. She fed me when I was forgotten. She saw me not as a burden, but as a man. And through that kindness, she brought me back to myself." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small box. Velvet, simple. Then he knelt, right there, before the soldiers, before the town, before the woman who had changed everything. "Eliza James," he said softly, voice shaking just a little. "Will you marry me? The man you fed, the soul you saved, the soldier you reminded what it means to be human." Her hands flew to her mouth, her knees nearly buckled, but she dropped beside him, eyes wet, voice strong. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Aiden, 1,000 times yes." The crowd erupted. Applause rang out like thunder. Soldiers lowered their salutes and cheered. Flags waved. Bells chimed. The quiet town of Maplewood echoed with a joy it had not known in years. And in the middle of it all stood a waitress and a soldier, no longer strangers, no longer broken. Just 2 people who found each other over a single, quiet act of kindness. The wedding took place in the very heart of the community they had helped build, inside the modest kitchen of the Maplewood Veterans and Families Center. No chandeliers, no string quartet, no champagne tower. Just the warm scent of chicken soup simmering on the stove, fresh-baked bread cooling by the window, and a dozen pots of wildflowers arranged on every table by volunteers who insisted love deserved beauty, no matter the budget. Eliza wore a simple white dress, borrowed from the center's donation closet, and altered lovingly by 3 retired nurses who used to sew uniforms. Her hair was pinned with sprigs of baby's breath, and her only jewelry was a locket she had found in her mother's belongings years ago. Inside was a photo of her as a baby, held by a man in uniform. She did not know his name, but today she felt seen. The crowd was small but sincere. Neighbors, veterans, children she had read to during Tuesday lunches, women she had cooked beside, and of course, the 300 soldiers who had first lined up to salute her weeks ago. Not all could return, but dozens had, arriving in clean boots and pressed uniforms, eyes shining with reverence. Aiden stood at the front, not in his military blues, but in a simple gray shirt rolled at the sleeves, and his old dog tags around his neck. His vows were short, but not small. "I could have given you a ring," he said softly, taking her hands, "but you never needed proof, so instead I give you this." He removed one of the tags from his chain. It was newly engraved. "You saved a soldier's soul." Eliza's breath caught. He placed it gently in her palm. "I don't need the world to know what you did," he said. just for you to carry this, and know someone lived because of you." Her hands trembled. She kissed the tag before hanging it around her neck, above her heart. After the ceremony, guests gathered around folding tables, where bowls of soup were passed from hand to hand, where laughter rose like music, and where every toast was made in mugs of hot tea. Eliza had never seen anything more beautiful. Later that night, she stepped outside, to the back of the center, where a new wooden sign had been hung, just above the kitchen door. Aidan had carved it himself, every letter smoothed with care. "This place does not serve just meals. It feeds the soul." She smiled. Behind her, she heard Aidan's footsteps. He slipped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "We built something," he whispered. "More than just a kitchen." She nodded, leaning back into him. "A kind of home." Inside, the light from the kitchen glowed, soft and golden, through the window. Then the door creaked open. A small boy stepped in, maybe 8 or 9, wearing a tattered hoodie 2 sizes too big. His eyes wide, hands stuffed in his pockets. Eliza turned, her voice gentle. "Are you hungry?" He nodded. "Do you like soup?" Another nod. She knelt beside him, smiling. "How about a bowl of hot chicken soup and a story about how kindness travels farther than you think?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Do you have one about a soldier?" Eliza reached for his hand. "I have one about a soldier and the woman who served him a meal he never forgot." Aidan set another bowl on the table, and as they sat down beside the boy, as the room filled again with the quiet comfort of people choosing to care, Eliza knew the truth. She would never be famous, never be on magazine covers or national news again. But here, in this little kitchen with chipped tile floors and hand-painted signs, she had everything she ever needed: a purpose, a partner, a place where no one was invisible. And as laughter echoed down the hall, and the soup steamed against the cold night air, Eliza looked around and thought, "You do not need medals to be remembered. Sometimes all it takes is one warm meal, and a heart that stays open, even when the world closes its eyes." If this story warmed your heart, reminded you of the quiet strength we all carry, and the power of one small act of kindness, we invite you to stay with us for more. Here on Soul-Stirring Stories, we share tales that touch the soul. Stories about everyday people who make an extraordinary difference simply by choosing compassion. If Eliza's journey inspired you, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that might just change the way you see the world. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the greatest heroes wear aprons, not armor.